Hi, Dr. Rajesh.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We have all the speakers now, and we are also going live right now. So we'll start in a few minutes, but we're just setting up, so because it takes few minutes anyway.
So only four of us are there?
No, this is just the speakers. I haven't let the audience.
No, in terms of speakers.
Yes,
Okay,
yes. I mean, we can't. Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So in a few minutes, I'll let the others
All
in
right.
now. Hello, everyone. I think we are good to start now. Just note that we are also going live. So good afternoon and good evening to you from wherever you're joining. I'm Sabra from the Asia Democracy Network. Today we're launching our latest democracy overview, Signals from the Street, Civic Resistance and Democratic Trajectories in Asia. So just to briefly situate this report, the Democracy Overview is an annual publication we started last year at ADN. The 2024 edition looked more broadly at democratic trends across the region, while this year we are focused more specifically on youth-led mobilizations, given how prominent and politically significant they've become across different contexts. So for 2025, we looked at movements in Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, Mongolia, and the Philippines. So very different contexts, but shaped by similar frustrations around accountability, governance, and the future. So today's conversation is really a chance to step back and reflect on what these movements are telling us, drawing from both the country experiences and the broader regional picture. So, and the question we are really sitting with is, what do youth-led movements actually change, and where do they fall short? So I'll first run you through how I'm going to run this session. We'll start with a short framing from Dr. Rajesh Tandon to help situate this moment regionally. Then we'll move on into three parts of the discussion, looking at what happens after uprisings and when we see visible change, and also when systems push back or absorb pressure. So each part will be led by one speaker, our country contributors, followed by brief reflection from the other speakers. So we'll then come back for a short regional synthesis and open up for a few audience reflections before we close. So maximum, like we'll go on for about an hour. I'll quickly introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Rajesh Tandon, founder president of Participatory Research in Asia. We have Reza Rahman Lenin, academic activist joining us from Bangladesh. We have Kirle Odonchimed, advisor at Women for Change NGO in Mongolia. And we have Faith Sadikan from Camp Queer in the Philippines. Thank you for being here. I think we can dive right in. So I'd like to start with Dr. Tandon. Dr. Tandon, across the 5 cases in the report, youth-led mobilization emerges in very different contexts, but with strikingly similar pressures and patterns. How should we understand this moment? Are these isolated national developments, or are we looking at something more structural across the region? You have 5 minutes for your intervention, Dr. Rajesh.
Thank you, Sabra. Good to be here. Uh, Thank you, colleagues. Uh, and thank you for convening conversation and reflection on extremely important and topical theme for our region. Each event, each uprising, each protest had a particular specific trigger at a point in time, in a geography, in a location. But there are some common underlying structural drivers which one can reflect upon as providing the foundation for discontent among the youth. First of all, we have been witnessing a very rapid growth of young population in each of these countries. And along with the rapid increase in youth population, there is also rapid access to more professional and higher education, which in turn makes young people more aspirational, both in terms of types of employment and nature of uh, resources they will access. And this phenomena, when it is placed in front of the rapid economic growth in the Asia region and countries in these case studies over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades since the turn of the millennium, 5, 6, 7% annual GDP growth means more money has been made in the country, more wealth has been accumulated, but there is very uneven distribution of that. So on the one hand, growing aspiration, more educational qualification, and on the other hand, greater economic inequality, fruits of the rapid economic growth disproportionately limited to a few, and historical, social, and geographic discrepancies, anomalies, deprivations reinforced. So there is a disconnect, therefore, between aspirations and opportunities that have been created. Employment opportunities remain restricted. In fact, many countries witness much higher percentage of highly educated unemployment. And therefore, their youth attempt to engage with formal political process have also been frustrating, causing anger and in a way creating the foundation for uh, protests to emerge. And this anger is a result of continued phenomena of corruption and very limited elite capture of formal political process. So perhaps 10, 15 years ago, political corruption, private use of public resources, essentially, was carried on in somewhat hidden backroom ways. But of late, in the last 5, 7 years, I would say, political corruption is being done openly as if there is, it's like impunity, that nothing is going to happen. So lavish lifestyles and scandals of corruption diverting funds from infrastructure development or human development programs to pockets of families associated with political leadership. And in a way, therefore, the formal channels of political participation and grievance redressal remain blocked. And it is therefore not a surprise that accumulated frustration and anger uh, gets occasional protest, kind of a phenomena that we witnessed in the last couple of years in these five and many other countries. In a particular way, it has also demonstrated a sort of blown away a myth that contemporary youth are, tied up to their digital platforms and are self-centered, mostly interested in their own personal and professional growth. In the olden days, in our days when we were students, college campuses, university campuses were fertile grounds for student mobilization, youth mobilization. And nowadays, those things have slowed down in many countries, but it doesn't mean that young people are not concerned about how politics happens, how formal institutions of governance function, which of late have been decaying and given taken over by the political elite. So same families get represented across governance institutions in parliament, in executive, and in judiciary, and thereby indicating a narrow bandwidth of control, ignoring aspirations of young people. So this phenomena, these underlying structural drivers have been present in almost all of these five countries, some more in some other. And I think that has prepared a ground in which specific protests and manifestations have taken place. Let me stop here and then move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. And then that really helps set the stage. Let's now move into the first part of the discussion. This first segment looks at what happens after uprisings, particularly when they lead to political rupture, but not necessarily stability. I'd like to now bring in Reza Rahman here. Reza, in Bangladesh, youth mobilizations contributed to a major political opening, even the collapse of the government. But the report shows that the instability and uncertainty continued beyond that moment. Are we sometimes mistaking moments of rupture for real transformation? And what actually determines whether changes take root? Reza, over to you.
Okay, thank you. A very good afternoon to everyone. The report is not only written by myself, my colleague Sajia Sharmin is also part of it, and she is also one of the authors of writing this report. So she is not participating, she is participating probably as a guest, but I am just presenting our collective contribution. So to me, the July-August 2024 uprising in Bangladesh serve as a actually profound case studies in difference between regime collapse and democratic transformation. And while the rupture was successful in removing an autocratic structure, which we sometimes call it as a fascist state, and the transitional phase has highlighted the stubbornness of systematic certain forms of roots, which actually immediately lead to us that what kind of change actually happened and what did not work. So the immediate aftermath of the uprising created a paradox of radical visual change and a deep-seated institutional continuity. That's why the debate actually started whether we will continue the 1972 Constitution, whether we will continue this repressive institution, which actually subjugated to human life and livelihood and also freedom of expression to all forms of fundamental freedoms. So what actually changed in that case, the fair barrier, the most significant shift was actually psychological liberation of the citizens and the culture of self-censorship and fear of state apparatus, particularly D88 type of Indonesia rapid action battalions, which actually a notorious force which killed almost 5,000 people in this country last 20 years. And disappearances and for disappearances is actually happened, police brutality and tortures actually done by those notorious law enforcement agencies. So what happened is the culture of self-censorship and fear of the state apparatus, the authoritarian consolidation mentioned actually in our report, which vanish overnight, to be honest. But then at the same time, when something is vanished, that reappear in a certain form in our psychological dynamics as well. And political vacuity, the top tier leadership and monolithic party structure also collapse, created an unprecedented political opening for new actors, particularly to the youth. But at the same time, what did not actually happen, the relationship between the bureaucracy, the police, law enforcement agencies, local patronized network remained as different form, and while the heads of these institutions were replaced even by the interim government immediately after the uprising, the incentive structure where loyalty is rewarded over merit remain largely untouched. In fact, the ordinances culture, as you know, that to maintain the state structure, to continue the state power. So they come up with a number of legal reform, like let's say that 133 presidential order, to the presidential order, they come up with the ordinances. But as these recently, after the election, there's a special committee in a discussion from the National Parliament that governance still relies heavily on executive ordinances rather than inclusive legislative debate, or even reflecting a continuity in how power is exercised. And obviously, youth as a trusted voice, practice, and perception being also dealt into our report. Mostly trusted voice they consider because they were seen as a heavily they have seen as having no vested interest initially, but in practice, this means that in immediate vacuum, the students were seen managing traffic, protecting neighborhoods, and even venting government decisions. They acted as a moral compass for nation for time being that distributed traditional politicians, that distrusted actually traditional politicians. And thus, burden of trust also sometimes is being trusted in a different forms, being trained in governance, and these lead to a situation where youth were expected to solve complex economic and legal crises overnight, leading to inevitable fictions when the purity of the movement meet the meaningless messiness, actually messiness of the administration largely. And Also, to be honest, there was a promises that human rights situation, fundamental freedoms issues will be developed, but unfortunately, the quantity probably not high like the earlier regime. But immediately, there are extrajudicial killings. 45 individuals extrajudicially killed. Political violence was quite high. Around 300 people died, and mob justice, quote unquote, of course, mob violence actually happened, and that also lead to around 200 people's killing into the street. So law enforcement agencies role quite fragile, and then altogether law and order situation was deteriorated. And then why this opening failed to become a structural reform, to be honest, and at this stage we are suffering because the transition from a moment of rupture to meaningful transformation is often blocked by the institutional interior. And obviously initial reforms focus of stability rather than structural redesign. When a government is in a crisis mood, particularly to the interim government earlier, it tends to use existing tool like, uh, the telecommunication related law, or even cyber safety, previous Digital Security Act, which rather turned into a Cyber Security Act. So these emergency mood actually initial reform focus on stability, but then obviously unlikely that traditional revolution lead by organized party. This was a decentralized by Gen J movement without a formal political organization to enter into halls of power. The youth remain external influence rather than internal decision makers. And then obviously this youth group are also involved into themselves to number of corruption scandal, corruption reality, and also power play dynamics, which actually help kind of uh, dehumanization process actually being also started by the youth leadership in number of cases, particularly in response to mob justices or mob violences. And institutional fragmentation was quite high as now of. The fluid leadership that allowed the movement to evade censorship, now making it a difficult censorship blocking or this kind of culture actually now makes it difficult to present an unified front, and different student faction and civil society groups have begun to diverge on the vision of the country, exclusion from the decision making. As I said, that these 133 ordinances, not necessarily there is a visible trend of returning to normalcy where elder technocrats
Reza, I
and
have to
yeah,
ask you to wrap. Huh?
yeah. So last point. So elder technocrats and traditional political players gradually sideline youth activists, leveling them as a inexperience for technical tasks of stretches, and violence and retribution is quite high. And last point, in my understanding, the limits of this mobilization alone is a destruction versus construction debate is still going on. The transitional gap, particularly this whole reform agenda, not necessarily help the institutional redesigning at all. So still national parliament is debating about these things, but still we consider this uprising not necessarily really brings the fruit of the working class and also people like us, like a human rights activists in the ground. So in to me, this current human rights situation, rule of law situation, and also over normalcy of this country is not really easily achievable. We are in normalizing the state of exception, and which is continued even if we have a elected regime in this country.
Right. Thank you, Reza. I'd like to bring in brief reflections now from Girly and Faith. Girly, anything you'd like to add from your context? Just like take a minute or two.
Of course. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for including Mongolia in this report. From our side, it started with this Instagram post, and because like before this it's easy to resign protest, which happened last year for 22 days, led by Gen Z. Before this movement, youth group, especially the Gen Z voters, were seen as the lowest participated voter for election, both in the national and the local election levels. And the two things this protest shaped and changed was that politically, it led to this resignation of the prime minister, Оюун Эрдэнэ Намсрай, by that time. And second thing was that the youth was seen as this lowest interested group in the politics, but the protests which happened for which was the most active protest which happened for last decade. So it shaped this youth participation and this youth and social spirit for democracy ideology, I would say.
Okay, clearly. Faith, do you have any reflections on what Reza said?
Yeah. Actually, in the context of the Philippines, I would say that the impact is also on the cultural side. So like after the well, the youth protests were met with both physical and discursive policing. So after the youth protest, a number of young people were jailed, and also discursively, their bodies, appearances, and political affiliations were immediately subjected to some kind of moral and social judgment. So some groups were cast as gangs and stigmatized as threats to public order. And while this is happening, other parts of the community also like found affinity with their culture, style, and modes of expression, and like owning it. And this, I think, to me, this shows that the process reflect how the state and society produce categories of legitimacy, and also it also shows that certain communities actually engage with and claim these categories on their own terms. Yeah.
Thanks, Faith. Really, okay, we can move on to the second segment now of this. Here we are looking at moments that appear to be clear successes where mobilizations leads to visible outcomes. Kirali, let me bring you in here. In Mongolia, sustained youth mobilization, like you said, led to the resignation of your prime minister, which from the outside looks like a clear breakthrough. But how meaningful was the outcome in practice? And what does success actually look like when deeper systems remain unchanged? You have like about 5 minutes for your intervention.
Yeah. As you said, the resignation happened, but the ruling party is still in the power. We have like different person, but from the same political party. So it looks like it came with success, but the most important question is how do we, as public, intergenerationally keep the success which Gen Z brought to us, if we look at the broader political impact, which didn't come easier, because what Gen Z happened was that the classical political manipulation and backlash tactics, including social media backlashes, social media trolls, organized troll backlash, and as well as interruption and the parallel protest at the same square where they were protesting. So the Gen Z is according to the democratic age group, it's under 30 years old youth, and most of the organizers were under 30 years old, and it's they organized the protest for 22 days and they kept the organizing happened until he resigned. So during that 2-3 weeks, the organizers they didn't have this resources and other supports as organized or classic traditional civil society organizations or groups, right? So what they had was that their own ability and resources as social media influencers, because most of the organizers were had and have many followers on Instagram and Facebook. So they called for organizing through their organized social media pages, so that people trusted the union, and mostly interpersonal trust. That was what brought us to the square, was that interpersonal trust, because the protest is happening after a decade of unsuccessful organization of this kind of protests. So it became hard to trust when somebody come to the square and call for an organization. So what helped us to come to the organizing was that interpersonal trust, I would highlight. Yeah, and secondly, another thing it changed was this the how politics is going in here, which is somehow based in social media discussions, because the social discourse in the most of the social discourse is happening on Facebook in Mongolia. So how political discussions are being made is that politicians want to kind of this lead the social media discussion, and if they want to see their own interest of decision at the parliamentarian house. So the social media and this organized political discourse is going really heavy in here. So so that no one from the previous senior generation was able to counter that streaming. But the Gen Z, the younger generation, was apart from that discourse and politics and everything, so that they were able to just come up with their own agenda and own idea to the main square. So, and also what called them to the square was that the lavish lifestyle and social media posts from the elite group. So it was, which was closer for them than any political agenda or any political law discussion to them, because what's clear and closer for them is that brain drain and this economic crisis, what we are happening, and living every day now. But on social media, like some people were having different lifestyle, right? So which kind of awakened their inner feeling for justice. So I think so that younger people were more courage to come to the square and call for justice. I would say, yeah.
Thanks, Girly. Quick reflections from Reza and Faith. Like, tell me, like, what in terms of like outcomes, how do you, from your experiences, how do you see the question of success? Reza, maybe you could start, but like keep it very brief, 1 to 2
Yeah,
minutes.
for in Bangladesh context, what Lily actually said is absolutely true. Like all in a sudden, the protest leaders are become a very rich elite section of the society. Their lifestyle absolutely changed, which actually lead to them to even out of the people's touch. And then it's actually happened to certain particular after the party formation of a student wing, student youth groups. And at the same time, these are the people who are very much interested about larger political debate, institutional reform, and their own personal agendas were not necessarily very high, but later stage, gradually when time elapsed, and they became adjusted to this old pattern of old pattern and fashion of corruption lifestyle, corruption lead lifestyle. But obviously, immediately, like let's say that for 5 6 months it was very much in touch with the people, but later is not necessarily, because mistrust and distrust was quite huge, and at this stage is so high. And obviously, on the other hand, the movement actually being organized in our context also by social media, particularly through the blogging and also Facebook. Particularly, Facebook played a very essential role to bring students into the protest. But just one thing to share here, and I will end here. Uh, Almost 17 days, 21 days, the internet was shut down in Bangladesh, and then people were killed into the street while the internet was shut down. So we don't know that how many people actually were brutally attacked at that time, killed into the street. Later we figured out it's around, according to UN, is a 1400 plus, and government data suggests that around 900 now. So it's actually in the International Crimes Tribunal, which we have in our country, that consider that actually deal with the crime against humanity. So internet shutdown lead to a crime against humanity in Bangladesh, and I'm not sure that whether such situation happen in many other parts of the world or not, but its crime against humanity continued in Bangladesh into the street by shutting down the internet. And now we have a law. Not there's no scope for shutting down the internet for a single moment. But now the current parliament is thinking not to have this law because they think this is essentially lead for to control public and ethical values and other things. So there is a essential need for the state perspective that internet shutdown will continue in coming months, coming years in Bangladesh.
Reza, yeah. Faith, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah. In the Philippines, I would say that at the state level, since the protest, the state has been struggling to legitimate itself. Investigations were launched, elite reshuffles were also performed, but these are largely, I would say, performative gestures that do not really challenge the historically entrenched systems that produce inequality and exclusion. But however, at the level of the movements, this is, I think, the most crucial in terms of the project for democracy, because I think, like, at least for the people that I have talked to, some portions of them have actually been paying attention to the methods of the Gen Zs, which some would say as decentralized, network, and digitally mediated. So that also reflects a kind of politics of improvisation and resilience. So these forms actually of resistance reflect a deep experiential knowledge of dissent. And this is not something that is new to the Philippines. This phenomenon has been emerging through queer and youth subcultures, and right now, after the Gen Z protests, like, movements have been closely paying attention to these methods.
Thanks, Faith. So we'll move on to the final segment now. This part looks at how movements are received and who gets to define what is considered legitimate. So Faith, I'm bringing you here. In the Philippines, youth mobilization raised deep frustrations about governance and exclusion, but also faced questions around legitimacy, including from within civil society. I mean, we saw it across the other countries too. So who gets to define what legitimate protests look like, and what happens when youth movements challenge these boundaries? You have 5 minutes for your intervention.
Yeah, thank you, Sabra, for organizing this event. So just to provide the context, in the Philippines, actually youth resistance has long existed within a landscape of contestation. It is mostly shaped by historical, political, and social forces, and is continually negotiated in the face of repression and co-optation as well. So from the organizing of Kabataang Makabayan in the late 1960s, which brought young people into mass movements against imperialism and inequality, to the period of dictatorship under the Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the father of our current president, youth activism was seen not merely as moments of dissent, but also as a threat to the very foundations of power. So as a result, it was not met only with brutal repression, but also with efforts at containment. And in fact, the creation of structures like the Sangguniang Kabataan, it's the Youth Council, it's the state's institutional youth arm, was an attempt to redirect youth participation into more controlled, legible forms. No? And participation was made more manageable, less disruptive, easier to contain. And the thing is that tension has actually never disappeared. So the youth still stay at the heart of the struggles over what is considered acceptable participation and over who gets to define the boundaries of democracy itself. But we know that the standards used for determining legitimacy is never neutral. It is shaped by history, by colonial ideas of order, by class biased expectations, by assumptions about who can speak and how. So I think traditional ideas of legitimacy rest on a narrow vision of the public sphere, one that assumes participation is civil and orderly, and that the sphere is free from influence of social inequalities. However, historically excluded and underrepresented marginalized groups do not simply wait to be included in this sphere. As I've mentioned earlier, in the Philippines, there have been a lot of counter publics. They create counter publics, alternative spaces where they can articulate their own experiences, demands, and perspectives. So in the Philippines, the youth movements have often operate as these counter publics. They organize outside formal institutions. They mobilize in the streets, campuses, and online spaces. They create shows, performances, artistic performance, and they speak and act in ways that may not conform to conventional expectations of politeness, restraint, or what is deemed politically productive. No? And this is precisely where the tension emerges. So strikes, occupations, direct actions are quickly labeled as excessive or illegitimate. So the question is, why are the forms of expression accepted more readily than others? So anti-colonial and anti-racist thinkers have long noted that acceptable protest is shaped by histories of control. Anger from the margins is frequently interpreted not as legitimate response to structural injustice, but as barbarism or savagery. Disruption is also read as a threat to order, while the everyday violence of inequality remains normalized and invisible. So often those who are already socially illegitimate, in this way, they are the ones who receive these kinds of social delegitimization. So in this way, the state and dominant society discipline dissent, dismiss marginalized voices, and quietly constrict the boundaries of democratic space. But in the context of the Philippines, disruption does not emerge out of nowhere. It arises in response to structural constraints. What is often dismissed as anger or excess is in fact deeply embodied. It carries the memory of communities that have endured years of fear during the Philippine drug war and reflects the ongoing lived experience of poverty, exclusion, and policing. It is the body's response to the cumulative weight of structural injustice. So while youth protests may appear fleeting or isolated moments of disruption, they do something enduring, especially for movements. They confront power, shift narratives, open spaces for others to act, and influence how movements grow and sustain themselves. So they have been the protest. Actually, I think has reminded the movements that political analysis and alternatives must also be grounded in the body, in lived experience and in the ways people inhabit resistance. So when we question the legitimacy of a protest, we must also, I think, interrogate the frameworks that define legitimacy itself. Like, whose interests do these definitions serve, and whose voices are disciplined or excluded in the process? So, I think for me and for the people that I have talked to for this report, if democracy is like to have a substantive meaning, it must also make space not only for what we are used to in the in the democracy movement, but also for practices and expressions and claims that disrupt, exceed, or challenge existing frameworks. This requires, of course, a willingness to loosen the rigid boundaries that dictate what is recognized as valid, intelligible, or acceptable within the political order. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Faith. You raised some really important points for us to think about as civil society, like institutions. Let me bring in a brief reflections now from Reza and Girli. Did similar tensions come up in Bangladesh, especially after the uprising, Reza?
I think so. In Bangladesh, the youth won the battle of legitimacy on the street, but they are currently struggling with the perception of disruption in the halls of power. And the challenge is to prove that youth leadership isn't just about breaking a system, but about the discipline construction of a new one. And but as the movement moved from overthrowing regime to a reconstructing a state in 2025 and 2026, half of it, and then the public perception began to be fragmented because mob justice versus rule of law. Because in the month of following the collapse of Sheikh Hasina, instance of instant justice harassments of former officials and forced resignation in the schools, offices, number of institutions began to be viewed as a radical overreach. But criticals argue that while the intent in reform, the method mimics the authoritarianism it replaces. And economic disruption continued strikes in the garment sector, ready-made garments industry, which is one of the largest in Bangladesh to earn petrodollar, or blockade for various demonstrates increasingly perceived as a disruption to a fragile economy. And this quote unquote West Asia war, which is an aggression actually by the supreme powers, and continue to be normalize the genocide in Iran. It's also affecting Bangladesh because that's probably we will be the first country which will suffer for energy crisis. And now the public initially supported to all the protesters at the time in now showing that protest is fatigue and viewing that new mobilization as obstacles to their daily survivals. Religious and identity politics come back like 1971, like 1947, when some faction within the movement have push for more conservative and identity-based reform, and this has led secular or minority groups to perceive certain branches of the youth movement as radical or exclusionary revolutionary, threatening the inclusiveness image of original uprisings. So, to me, in final words, I think meritocracy as a universal meritocracy is an universal value is not necessarily respected. Sacrifice and martyrdom, the heavy-handed state response, and the loss of young lives like Abu Said being a primary symbol, transform protesters into patriots. But these protesters versus patriots not necessarily deal the justice. And the former interim government, actually, which is led by a Nobel laureate Mohammad Yunus and other respectable civil society members, joined in the government and lost the trust. And I'm not sure that how this transition lent a veneer of legality to what was essential as a revolutionary rupture. So that what lead to Bangladesh, where at this stage, I don't know, we have a former friendship with those very veteran human rights defenders, civil
Thanks,
society.
Reza. I have to interrupt you there.
Yeah.
Generally, do you have any quick reflections on this, on how legitimacy was negotiated in your context? If not,
I agree with Faith. I think the legitimacy is in the hand of who tells the story, right? And in that case, I think this democratic overview in the Asia as a region is very important for us to write our own story from perspective of Asian activists from the countries, and I also the legacy and legitimacy is the same. That in Mongolia, what Gen Z protests brought was also they opened their space by claiming political space beyond the classic and traditional age group. They stretched it into young 20s group. Also, what they brought is also regionally it's the same, that they single-handedly countered the power which holds political, economic, and regional power within the system, right? And of course, the civil society was also involved. The National Human Rights Commission, together with Human Rights Forum of NGOs, were doing official documentation and observation of the protest everywhere in rotation, so that if any case happened, like military or police get involved, they were ready to defend the younger protesters, which is also based on our lessons learned from previous protests, which happened in 2008. And yeah, as I said, lessons learned from previous protests, civil society was also organized and ready to support in hand for the younger generation. But I think what civil society also did was that they stepped back from their traditional role as a leading role for the social change, in this case, but they let the younger generation lead with their own call and own experience of this life, right? Yeah.
thanks, Shirley. So I'm rushing in the interest of time. So I think like this brings us to some of the bigger questions across all the cases, and I'm going to go back to Dr. Tandon. Dr. Tandon, taking these cases together, what do they tell us about the limits of democratic change today, and what should we be paying closer attention to going forward? Dr. Tandon, over to you in your 5 minutes.
Mute. Yeah. And you need to
On
unmute him.
mute. On mute. He's on mute.
Dr. Tandon, you to unmute.
Oh, my
Okay.
apologies. I got excited. I was saying thank you very much for your reflections, because reading the document is one thing, and listening you and your passion behind it gives another message. So thank you. Uh, I, I think one of the phenomena in democratic governance in our Asian region that we have not paid adequate attention to is the inroads that corporates and big business and big finance has made in decision making. In the last 10, 15 years, the economic elites of the modern era and the contemporary political elites have become close bedfellows. And as a result, the spaces for open, contested political participation, even on the floor of parliament or in local governance institutions, are shrinking. So, one of the lessons from these youth movements is how can we explore and legitimize political participation in spaces outside the formal electoral process, in parallel to formal electoral process, because in those formal electoral process, the existing convergence of interest between political and economic elites make participation token and not substantive. The second phenomena that emerges from this is that the protests are a manifestation of underlying structural causes, and therefore, in the Asian region, attention needs to be paid quickly to the rising economic inequality and, in a way, the desperate situation for young people. So, on the one hand, we talk about demographic dividends. On the other hand, the youth remain marginalized and their aspirations remain frustrated. A third phenomena about democratic governance that um, come to my mind in these examples is that participation is no longer limited to physical, traditional form of political organizing. Digital organizing, digital come physical organizing, local organizing, connecting to national or regional organizing are new ways in which participation in democratic spaces is being expressed. And many of these spaces remain delegitimized in the formal political platforms. And as has been mentioned by one or two of you, they are now increasingly subjected to digital surveillance. And therefore, the restrictions that surveillance and shutting down of internet or taking down various social media handles has become full-time engagement of dominant political forces in many of the democratic countries in our region. There are important lessons for civil society, especially for the civil society which is formally organized and has a history of legacy of NGO development work. Because obviously, these various currents that were underground in the society, that young people were beginning to shape their own conversations, did not really connect with formally organized civil society. And as a result, many of them may have been quite surprised when protests suddenly took place. And this is not very different from the phenomena 10, 15 years ago in the Arab Spring time or Occupy movement in other parts of the world. So, what has happened is that the citizenship as a basis for organizing, the dignity and personal liberties of young people as a basis of organizing political engagement has been forgotten by contemporary civil society and more become organized forms of delivering some services. So even formally organized civil societies do not provide space for youth engagement and participation, despite their commitment to active citizenship. And I think the the lessons from these movements, youth movements, need to be taken to heart. But let us not forget that changes will appear to be sometimes not significant, and we may lose heart. But each protest, each mobilization acts as an educational experience, especially for the younger generation. And it also becomes a signal to the political elites that the way they have been functioning will continue to be resisted. So even if the transformation of democratic institutions does not take place wholeheartedly, I don't lose heart in this. I think a periodic recurrence of such protests at a scale that happened in many of these countries is an important part of democratizing our governance. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Now we will take brief reflections from the audience, if there are any. Or if there are any questions, please leave it on the chat as well. Okay, I'm assuming there aren't any.
Sabra, can I come in? This is Kaustu here.
Yes, Dr. Costa, sure.
Yeah, thank you. It was such an interesting conversation. I have one reflection and one questions for Rajaur. I think Dr. Tandon and Faith have alluded this point that this periodic venting out, against accumulated frustration, and it's in the form of a protest, is a hope, and it's a hope because it's an antidote to undemocratic, functioning of the institution. What various, cases have sort of taught us. One thing is the reposing faith in the democracy, and in a democracy which is sort of beyond procedural democracy, but a substantive practice of citizenship. That is a continuous process, and the story from the Philippines is sort of indicating that. These two cases were not in the document, but we, from our own experience from Sri Lanka and Nepal, Nepal has been included in this publication, but particularly learning from the Sri Lanka and Nepal have taught us that how such movements periodically recalibrated the political functioning of the elites. It's challenging them and compel them to rethink the possibilities of a kind of more alternative politics. The question to Rejaud is that how important it is to keep the liberal values at the core of this movement. And I am asking this question particularly in the Bangladesh context, where before the election and during the election, a large part of the movement got aligned with religious fundamentalist group, and in a way, sort of it challenged a lot of liberal values that many progressive civil society would like to keep close to their heart. And this is particularly important even during the movement. How gender inclusive was this movement? The most prominent faces were males. There were females, but those kind of liberal values, did they make any part in the larger movement? I would love to hear Rajaur's reflection.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Kaustov. Reza, if you can answer that question.
Thank you, Dr. Kasav. Very nice to listen to it. But at the same time, I think that two, three things need to be really mentioned, and not in Bangladesh context, but in our Asian context. First is that we were looking for alternatives, and these protest movement, uh, uh, getting out from these autocrat regimes in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Mongolia, it's not yet, Philippines and other places. So that was essentially an alternative. But then we are in a time where we are looking for an alternative to the hijacked alternatives, because those alternatives were being given, provided, achieved, or even secured without even a safety mechanism, safety rules and regulations, what we actually taught in our day-to-day NGOized, liberalized positioning to give the training and other things. But that not necessarily required when the people's in the street. But these alternatives are really hijacked to me, and we are looking for an alternative to the hijacked alternative. Second thing is there is a systematic attempts to these universities, particularly that erosion of memories, eraser of the memories, that actually very systematically this elite section of the societies are actually quite successful in my understanding. And also I have more question to myself and also to others, the participants, and also who are listening later on, that similar forms of movements our senior generations actually did. And then in Europe, 80s, 70s to 80s, these things happen. Arab Spring, Sandor also mentioned, and also in our own zone, number of these kind of protests are actually happen. And then what we are actually looking for, and what we are actually try coming up with a solution, whether our thought process are indigenous, whether our process is naturally being collective knowledge development way we are indigenous way we are developing. In my understanding, this is not, because the way we are dealing with this quote unquote right wing and left wing, that framework not necessarily works anymore. That liberalism has an inherent limits. It has its own disturbance. That's why this failed, and then there was a war on terror dynamics. We actually faced almost 20 years. And now this later stage, now Trump administration and other autocratic regimes are around in Asia and Europe. So I don't think that we are really working ourselves, because Islam versus secularism doesn't work. Islam has a thousands, Islam or any other quote unquote conservative religion, is a Hindu religion, or even Christianity, Anglican church-based Christianity, that has its own different formations, hundreds of sects they have, all of them. And secularism model is also at least 12 particular different models in 12 different zone is functioning. But are we aware of those? Are we interpreting those things around immediately after the colonization period? Whether we are jumping into neoliberal legality at this stage. So these are to be really genuine question to me, and these indigenous questions need to be really nurtured, not necessarily with this NGOized liberalization framework where donation is dependent. We are driven, and also this elite section, certain elite section is running our shows in the name of civil society even. So I don't think that we are doing that decolonization of our education system, and also this whole eraser of the memories attempt need to be heavily tackled. And at the same time, we need to go back to more representative, participatory, democratic formation, not necessarily which actually being exercised in this liberal context, to be honest. I really don't subscribe to this very monolithic right and left wing, or right and progressive dynamics at all, because it's not necessarily is functioning. I'm not
Thanks,
sure that
Reza.
I've
I'm getting the signals to close now.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. To our speakers, Dr. Rajesh, Faith, Kirli, and Riza, and to all of you who joined us today. I'll just end with a few reflections that really stood out from this conversation. Across the cases we've discussed, youth mobilization is not the exception anymore. It's becoming a defining feature of how politics is being contested in the region. It's not new. But what comes also through is that mobilization alone does not guarantee transformation. We're seeing moments of rupture, moments that look like success, and also moments where systems adapt without really changing. So, and in many cases, the deeper issues around power, institutions, and inclusion remain much harder to shift. So, but at the same time, what has changed is how young people are engaging with democracy. They're not waiting to be included, they're directly shaping how power is challenged, negotiated, and understood. And I think that raises an important question for all of us as civil society, as institutions, and as democratic actors. Are we adapting to this shift, or are we still trying to fit these movements into older frameworks that no longer hold? So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. And we encourage you to read the full report, Signals from the Streets, which is on our website. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Bye.
Thank you, Ichel.
Yes. Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.